vinyl community? Welcome to another video with the Record Spinner. In today's video, I'm going to be doing an analysis on the stereo and mono Beatles catalogs. I did promise this video back when I did a video showcasing the stereo and mono vinyl box sets that I had acquired at the time. If you want to peel back on my channel and check that video out, please go ahead and do so. I know I'm a little late on this, but as they say, better late than never. It was an intense period of Beatleness when it came to listening to the contents of both of these box sets. I first started off with the mono box simply because I had not heard of most of the mono mixes of those albums, with the exception of like the first four albums, because I was used to the 1987 CDs of those first four albums because they were done only in mono. And plus also just, all the hype of them using the original analog tapes and fidelity and this and that. So I really wanted to go for that first. And then after that, and that was like within about a week time span. And then I went back and listened to the stereo mixes. And then it was the tedious task of being both mixes and doing a lot of comparing and contrasting and just a lot of note taking when it came down to like what aspects of one mix was different from the other. And it was just a crazy rabbit hole that I found myself in. And yeah, quite intense, but a very cool experience because, back then, when I started collecting vinyl, I just wanted one copy of an album in really, really great shape, and then I was happy. But then now, you get into stereo and mono, and then stereo remixes and stuff, and it's just a whole world has kind of opened up for me in some cases. Now, the topic of the Beatles catalog in stereo and mono is kind of a mixed bag. Some people swear by the mono and only that, simply because that is what the band intended. Some people like stereo for their own reasons. It's very subjective, and that's the key word in this video, subjective, because the mixes that I'm showing in this video that I think are the best ways to experience these albums are my opinion, and that's essentially it. I am not the voice of reason, and I am not going to go as far as to say that one other's opinion is false. If you're watching this video and you're a Beatles fan and you're curious on which albums are experienced best in which format, then this video will suit you well. Or if you're a fan and you just want to hear another fan's opinion, that's great too. But enough of the chit-chat, let's jump into what this video is all about. So, I think it goes without saying that the first two albums, Please Please Me and With the Beatles, are best experienced in mono. And that is partly down to the way that these albums were recorded. They were only recorded on 2-track tape machines. And when it came to the stereo mixes, it was a case where you had the instrumentation panned all the way in the left speaker, and then the vocals coming out of the right. So it was a very kind of wonky kind of listening experience when it came to stereo. And just let alone, it's just the recording arrangement itself is very sparse. So having it so simplified, it comes across much better in the mono format. Then by the time they got to Hard Day's Night in 1964, they had upgraded to 4-track recording. And the stereo mix of A Hard Day's Night is not bad, but I went ahead and chose the mono mix for a couple of reasons. And this is when you get down to them using different takes and such between mixes, and that's why sometimes you'll hear a part that sounds not quite the same as it was in stereo when you listen to the mono. On this album, on the stereo version of I Should Have Known Better, there's the harmonica bit going on in the beginning of the song before the first verse. You'll hear a harmonica break, which almost seems like a breath break, and then John finishes up the harmonica thing. Whereas in mono, it is a continuous piece, which I remember when I first heard the harmonica break when the stereo version was remastered for CD back in 2009. I heard that and I'm like, wait a second, did something happen with the master tape? What's up? I did not know back then that I was listening to the mono version because I wasn't really keen on, that, subject matter, but it kind of made sense later on as I got more into this kind of stuff. And then on the song If I Fell, there's a line in the stereo version. It's I'm trying to think what line it is. Would be sad if our new love was in vain. In the stereo version, Paul sounds like he's kind of like struggling to hit that note, and whereas in mono, it comes across much more smoother and with a little bit more confidence. And just listen for yourself. I'm not going to include audio samples here because the YouTube copyright police will hunt me down for this. But yes, the mono version of A Hard Day's Night is the way to go. And just like I said, with people, swearing by the mono mixes, with the next album, Beatles for Sale, it is a complete 180. Because I am going to go with the stereo version right here. I would say in terms of a stereo mix, and considering, how stereo mixes were handled back then, it's a rather decent separation of instruments. And this is when, they were slowly starting to grow their palette of instrumentation when it came to recording. And it spread over rather well. And personally, I thought that the sound in mono was kind of muddy in places. And it's also interesting, too, because a lot of people, swear by the stereo version of this album, in particular, when it comes down to some of the early albums. So stereo for Beatles for Sale. And then we get to Help. And Help, I think, is best experienced in stereo. Now, the version that I was most common with of Help was the 1987 stereo mix. And of course, I did not want to go by that because that is a whole controversial topic that I'm not going to get into. I actually went back and checked out the original 1965 stereo mix, which as of right now is only available on the mono CD box, which came out back in 2009. When it came to listening to that mix and the 1987 mix, the placement of the instruments is almost identical, with some of the vocals kind of being more centered. They did add some digital reverb to the 87 mix, especially on the track Dizzy Miss Lizzy. Personally, I don't take offense to it, but the reverb kind of adds a little bit of air to the recordings. But then again, there is the whole thing of it being digital reverb instead of analog reverb. It's something that I don't have time for. I'm sorry, I don't have time for that. If it sounds great to my ears, that is what matters. But yes, the stereo version of Help is the way to go. And then we get to Rubber Soul, and I'm going to go ahead and go with what is the mono version. And the stereo mix, it's weird. They pretty much took a step backwards when it came to the 1965 stereo mix. They pretty much mixed it in the same style that the first two albums were mixed, with the instrumentation on the left and the vocals on the right. Somehow that was back in fashion. I do not know. The 87 stereo mixes, they were kind of attempts to make them a little bit more modern sounding, but that kind of is a very, dividing factor. Some audiences like it, some audiences hate it. I grew up listening to the 87 mix of this album in stereo, and I personally really enjoyed it, but hearing it in mono was a great pleasure. And for me, I would say, in comparison, in terms of the placements of things, mono is the way to go for this album. And then we get to Revolver. And for this, I am going to go with mono. The stereo mix is not bad. I do enjoy the stereo mix, especially on Tomorrow Never Knows. But aside from the placements, there's also elements that are not featured in the stereo mix. You get some extra backwards guitar in I'm Only Sleeping, and there's also some extra background vocals in the last verse of Yellow Submarine. So it's really all down to what exactly you get with each mix, and sometimes you might get a little bit more in one than the other. So that is why I opt for mono for Revolver. And then we get to Sgt. Pepper. I am not going to pick the mono version. I'm not going to pick the stereo version. Well, actually, I kind of am. My vote goes for this right here. This is the 2017 stereo version. This is the best way to experience this album. Now, when it came down to Giles Martin creating this mix. He had essentially recreated the mono mix for this album, which, can be said is the blueprint of how this album was meant to be heard all along for 50 years. Essentially recreated the mix, but then using modern stereo mixing techniques, spread it all out in the stereo spectrum to where, no liberties were taken, and it is a very inviting sound. And considering the nature of this album, which is very experimental and there is a lot of variety in the music, it works well in this new stereo mix. And there is also a big difference. Now, since I had mentioned the remix, I'm going to talk a little bit about the original mono and stereo. And there is a big difference with that. And one of the key components in that difference are the tape speed and pitch variations. For example, in Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, when you listen to the stereo version, which can be said is perhaps the most common version that people are used to, you go back and listen to the mono version, it's a little bit slower in the speed and pitch, which means that they sped up the tape for the stereo version. And then in She's Leaving Home, there's a major pitch variation. In stereo, it is in the key of E. When you listen to mono, it is in the key of F. So they slowed down the tape for that. And then Lovely Rita in stereo. And then you listen to it in mono, and it's just slightly slower. It's those kind of things that you really start picking up on once you start listening to things a little bit more carefully. But if you want to go old school, I guess you could say the mono version, simply because that was the blueprint for this. But yes, the 2017 stereo mix is the best way to experience this album. And then we get to Magical Mystery Tour, and I am going to go with stereo for this. And this was kind of tough because, the stereo mix of this is not bad. There's backwards vocals, and I believe it's Blue Jay Way, that are not present in mono, which kind of takes away from the vibe of that particular song. There's a flanger in the vocal for Your Mother Should Know, which is kind of distracting in some areas. But unfortunately, the echo feedback effect in Baby You're a Rich Man is only on the mono version, and that's a real shame. If they included that in stereo, then this would be absolutely perfect, but for the most part, I'm going to go with the stereo version. And then we get to the White Album, and I am going to go down the exact same route as I did with Sgt. Pepper. My vote goes for the new 2018 stereo mix done by Giles Martin. Now, I'm going to talk first about the original stereo and mono. Now, when it came to this album, this is the one album that the Beatles themselves actually made intentionally to be entirely different, because they pretty much found out that fans were buying, both, stereo and mono versions just because they were different, and they saw this as a perfect, marketing effect for them to sell more records by making the versions distinguishably different between each other. Just to point out some examples of some of the notable differences is that there are some different aircraft sounds and back in the USSR between both mixes. There is a flanger effect in While My Guitar Gently Weeps, which is only in mono. The tape is sped up in mono for Don't Pass Me By. Of course, there is the extended outro and Helter Skelter. In stereo, it's the I Got Blisters on My Fingers bit. I gotta say, if you want to go down the old school route, the original stereo mix is done quite well, and it's kind of the sign of the times, because then you get to tracks like Revolution 9, and when it came down to creating the mono mix for the White Album, Revolution 9 is just simply a fold down of the stereo version, so that's just replicated on both speakers. But then again, just now thinking about it, that's probably the only viable option, because how do you go about mixing Revolution 9 in mono? It just kind of does not make sense. Now, the 2018 mix took elements that were both prominent in both the stereo and mono and kind of created the best of both worlds in a sense. You'll notice things in the mono mix that are prominent in this, and then you'll notice things in the stereo mix that are prominent in this. It's weird. When I first listened to this new version, I enjoyed it because of the clarity in the recording and just how there's like a little bit of air just brought back into those multi-tracks, but it wasn't the like mind-blowing experience that I had with Sgt. Pepper. But then again, stylistically, these two are different. So, if anything, I think this is the way to go because you essentially get the best of both worlds. And then we get to the Yellow Submarine album. Now, this was only made available in stereo, and that just goes to show that the White Album was the last album to be mixed in mono, and then that pretty much went out of favor, and then stereo was from there on in the dominant format. Now, with that said, there were mono mixes made for the songs that were exclusively featured in the film, which were Only a Northern Song, All Together Now, Hey Bulldog, and It's All Too Much. And for the longest time, they were unreleased until 2009 when the mono CD box set came out, and they were featured on the Mono Masters compilation. And personally, for me, I would much rather experience the Yellow Submarine stuff in mono because, you know, it's just featured on this. With the stereo album here, there is some duplication in terms of just songs because you do get the title track Yellow Submarine, which was on the Revolver album, and then you get All You Need Is Love, which was on the Magical Mystery Tour album, and then the second side is George Martin's instrumental scores, which are fantastic. I mean, very, very innovative, but the way that this album is formatted kind of reminds me of how the Americans packaged like the albums that kind of coincided with a film. So like, let's say if it was like Hard Day's Night or Help, you would get like those scores that are featured within the movie, which kind of adds a little bit more, I don't know how you can describe it. It makes a little bit more authentic to the film, but it just kind of reminds me of that, and it feels so out of place. But that's nothing to do with like dislike towards the scores. I think they're fantastic. It just doesn't, you know, fit well in the context of a Beatles album. It just doesn't. Maybe if it was an extra on a box set, maybe. But that's why, you know, if I want to hear the Yellow Submarine stuff, I'll go to the Mono Masters. And then for Abbey Road and Let It Be, you only got stereo, and that's all you got. I can't really comment too much else on that. These are just defaults. And then we get to Past Masters and the Mono Masters. Of course, here is Past Masters, Mono Masters. This is really, really tricky because it depends on how you look at it. I kind of give more points to the stereo counterpart, Past Masters, simply because it is a little bit more complete because you get tracks like The Ballad of John and Yoko, Old Brown Shoe, and the single version of Let It Be, which were only exclusively mixed in stereo. But then again, on the Mono Masters, you get the Yellow Submarine tracks. So it really depends on how you look at it. If anything, I'll probably go for the Past Masters. If this included the Yellow Submarine tracks, then perhaps this would be a perfect release. And then, on the other hand, you need to think, because since this is a compilation and it covers, you know, the entire scope of the Beatles' recording career, the earlier stuff like Love Me Do, From Me to You, and She Loves You works best in mono. And then when you work your way through, you know, things start, you know, gelling in the stereo spectrum. But then again, that's all subjective. But when it comes down to the Past Master stuff, I think stereo is the way to go for me. So there you go. That is my analysis on the stereo and mono Beatles catalogs. Here is a question for you guys. Which catalog do you prefer? Are there certain albums that you think work best in stereo than mono, or vice versa? Please drop a comment down below. I'd love to know. And if you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel. See you guys in the next video, and most importantly, keep the record spinning.